The emergency broadcast began at exactly 8:47 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on a Tuesday evening that would forever change the trajectory of global politics. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, dressed in his characteristic military fatigues, sat behind a simple wooden desk in what appeared to be a hastily arranged press room. The camera angle was slightly off-center, the lighting harsh, nothing like the polished productions the world had grown accustomed to from major political figures. "Citizens of the world," Traore began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with a momentous decision. "What I am about to reveal will shake the foundations of international relations and expose the true nature of power in our modern age." The live stream, initially broadcast on Burkina Faso's national television and simultaneously uploaded to social media platforms, had fewer than 50,000 viewers when it began. Within minutes, that number would explode into the millions as the most explosive political revelation of the decade unfolded. Traore reached into a manila envelope beside him and withdrew a stack of documents. "For months, I have been in possession of evidence that reveals a secret agreement between President Donald Trump of the United States and Elon Musk, the world's richest man. This agreement, negotiated in the shadows of democratic processes, threatens not just African sovereignty, but the very notion of fair global competition." The president's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Social media platforms immediately began lighting up with reactions, hashtags, and frantic shares. News outlets around the world interrupted their regular programming. In corporate boardrooms, emergency meetings were called. In government offices, phones began ringing incessantly. "The document I hold," Traore continued, lifting a bound folder, "details a comprehensive plan called Project Titan, a scheme to monopolize rare earth mineral extraction across Africa while simultaneously establishing a private space-based defense network that would give the United States unprecedented military and economic advantage over every other nation on Earth." The implications were staggering. Rare earth minerals were the lifeblood of modern technology, essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to advanced weapons systems. Africa possessed over 60% of the world's known reserves, and Burkina Faso, despite its modest size, sat atop some of the richest deposits on the continent. As Traore began reading from the documents, the details that emerged painted a picture of international intrigue that seemed almost too elaborate to be real. The alleged agreement, dated just 3 months prior, outlined a multi-phase operation that would unfold over the next decade. "Phase 1, Traore read aloud, involves the establishment of mining partnerships with African nations, offering infrastructure development in exchange for exclusive extraction rights. These partnerships would be managed through a network of shell companies owned jointly by the Trump Organization and Musk's various enterprises." The president paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. But here's where it becomes truly sinister. The infrastructure promised, roads, schools, hospitals, would be built using Chinese-manufactured materials purchased at inflated prices through intermediary companies. The African nations would receive the bills, but Trump and Musk would pocket the difference. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtag Project Titan began trending globally within minutes. Journalists scrambled to verify the claims while political commentators offered instant analysis. The stock markets in Asia, just opening for the day, showed immediate volatility as investors tried to process the implications. "Phase 2, Traore continued, involves the deployment of Starlink satellites equipped with advanced surveillance and defensive capabilities. While marketed as providing internet access to underserved regions, these satellites would actually form a comprehensive monitoring network, capable of tracking military movements, industrial activities, and even individual communications across the African continent." The technical specifications detailed in the documents were remarkably precise. The satellites would be equipped with high-resolution imaging systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and the ability to disrupt communications networks of any nation that opposed the operation. It was a level of surveillance and control that would make previous colonial arrangements seem benevolent by comparison. "Phase 3, the president said, his voice growing more grave, is perhaps the most troubling. Once the mining operations are established and the satellite network is operational, The agreement calls for the gradual assumption of security responsibilities across participating African nations. Private military contractors, funded through the mining profits, would essentially become the de facto military force across much of the continent. The room fell silent except for the hum of the camera equipment. Traore looked directly into the lens, his expression one of both anger and determination. In essence, my fellow Africans, we are being sold back into a form of technological colonialism that would make the worst excesses of the past look like child's play. What made Traore's revelations particularly explosive was not just the scope of the alleged conspiracy, but the apparent authenticity of the evidence he presented. The documents included detailed financial projections, technical specifications, and what appeared to be actual correspondence between high-level officials in both the Trump administration and Musk's companies. One particularly damning document was a series of encrypted messages, allegedly between Trump and Musk, discussing the timing of the announcement relative to election cycles and stock market conditions. The messages revealed a level of coordination that suggested the two men had been planning this operation for years. "Look at this message," Traore said, holding up a printed screenshot. "From Trump to Musk, dated 6 months ago. The African situation is perfect. They need infrastructure, we need resources. Your satellites make it foolproof. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, we'll control the entire supply chain." The response, allegedly from Musk, was equally revealing. Agreed. The beauty is that we're giving them exactly what they want: jobs, infrastructure, connectivity. They'll thank us even as we take everything of value. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the involvement of other major corporations and political figures. The documents suggested that the conspiracy extended far beyond just Trump and Musk, involving defense contractors, tech companies, and politicians from both major American political parties. "This is not a Republican conspiracy or a Democratic conspiracy," Traore emphasized. "This is a conspiracy of the wealthy and powerful against the rest of humanity." The documents show payments and promises made to officials across the political spectrum. The global reaction was immediate and intense. African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa called an emergency session. The European Union issued a statement demanding clarification. China's foreign ministry, clearly caught off guard, released a carefully worded response calling for transparency in international business dealings. In Washington, D.C., the response to Traore's broadcast was swift and chaotic. The White House press secretary was awakened at 4 a.m. Eastern Time and immediately pulled into an emergency meeting with senior staff. By 6 a.m., a hasty press conference had been arranged. The allegations made by President Traore are completely false and represent a dangerous attempt to undermine American business interests and foreign policy, the press secretary announced to a room full of skeptical journalists. President Trump has authorized a full investigation into how these fabricated documents were created and disseminated. But the administration's response seemed rushed and defensive. When pressed for specifics about which aspects of the documents were false, officials provided vague answers about operational security and ongoing negotiations. The lack of detailed refutation only fueled more speculation. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's response came through his characteristic medium, a series of increasingly agitated posts on X, formerly Twitter. His first post, published just hours after the broadcast, was typically cryptic. "Interesting fiction. Would make a good Netflix series." But as the day progressed and the story gained momentum, Musk's posts became more defensive and detailed. He denied any secret agreements with Trump, claimed the documents were deep fakes, and suggested that the entire affair was orchestrated by competitors who fear innovation. The problem for both Trump and Musk was that their denials seemed to contain just enough specific details to suggest they were indeed familiar with the documents in question. Legal experts noted that neither man had immediately called for law enforcement investigations into the alleged forgeries, which would have been the obvious first step if the documents were completely fabricated. The international response to Traore's revelations was as varied as it was intense. In Europe, the reaction was one of cautious concern mixed with strategic calculation. The European Union had been working to establish its own partnerships with African nations, particularly in the renewable energy sector, and the alleged American conspiracy presented both a threat and an opportunity. French President Emmanuel Macron, speaking from the Élysée Palace, was among the first European leaders to respond directly. If these allegations prove true, they represent a fundamental violation of international law and African sovereignty. France stands ready to support our African partners in investigating these claims and protecting their interests. The British response was more measured, with Prime Minister calling for careful investigation while avoiding direct criticism of American actions. The diplomatic dance was delicate. Britain needed to maintain its special relationship with the United States while also protecting its own interests in African markets. In Africa itself, the response was electric. Within hours of the broadcast, protests began forming outside American embassies in Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. African Union Chairman Moussa Faki Mahamat called for an emergency summit, while several African leaders publicly thanked Traore for his courage in exposing this neo-colonial plot. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's response was particularly pointed. For too long, Africa has been treated as a resource to be exploited rather than a partner to be respected. If these allegations are true, they represent the most sophisticated attempt at economic colonization in modern history. But perhaps the most significant response came from China. President Xi Jinping, speaking at a hastily arranged press conference in Beijing, offered both support for African sovereignty and a not-so-subtle reminder of China's own role on the continent. China has always respected African sovereignty and worked as an equal partner in development, she stated. We call on all nations to respect international law and African self-determination. China stands ready to assist African nations in protecting their interests and developing their resources for their own benefit. The Chinese response was particularly significant because it highlighted the broader geopolitical implications of the alleged conspiracy. For years, the United States had criticized China's growing influence in Africa, often describing Chinese investments as debt-trap diplomacy. The irony that America was now accused of an even more sophisticated form of economic colonialism was not lost on observers. As journalists and analysts began digging deeper into the documents released by Traore, the technical sophistication of the alleged conspiracy became even more apparent. The satellite specifications detailed in the documents were remarkably advanced, describing capabilities that went far beyond what Starlink had publicly announced. Dr. Sarah Chun, a satellite technology expert at MIT, analyzed the technical documents on a live television broadcast. If these specifications are accurate, we're looking at a surveillance network that would be unprecedented in human history. The described satellites would have the capability to monitor individual conversations, track vehicle movements, and even detect underground activity. The mining operation details were equally sophisticated. The documents described a system of extraction that would use advanced AI-driven equipment to maximize yield while minimizing visible environmental impact. The equipment would be manufactured in the United States but assembled in Africa using local labor, creating the appearance of job creation while ensuring technological dependence. It's brilliant in its deviousness, explained Dr. Michael Okafor, an economist specializing in African development. They're offering exactly what African nations need: jobs, infrastructure, technology transfer. But the fine print ensures that all the real value flows back to the United States. The financial projections in the documents were staggering. Over a 10-year period, the alleged conspiracy would generate an estimated $2.3 trillion in revenue, with approximately 70% flowing to American interests. The African nations would receive jobs and infrastructure, but would also take on debt obligations that would effectively mortgage their mineral resources for decades. Within 48 hours of Traore's broadcast, multiple investigations were underway. The FBI announced that it was looking into the authenticity of the documents, while the SEC began examining whether any securities laws had been violated in the alleged agreements. Internationally, the International Criminal Court announced that it would investigate whether the alleged conspiracy constituted crimes against humanity. The UN Security Council called an emergency session, though it was widely expected that the United States would veto any formal investigation. Perhaps most significantly, a consortium of international journalists began what they called Project Verification, a collaborative effort to authenticate the documents and investigate the broader allegations. The consortium included reporters from the BBC, Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, and several major African news organizations. The first breakthrough came from a financial analyst at the London School of Economics who noticed that the financial projections in the documents aligned perfectly with previously unexplained movements in the stock prices of several companies mentioned in the conspiracy. The correlation was so precise that it suggested either remarkable coincidence or authentic inside information. The probability that these financial movements occurred by chance is less than 1 in 10,000, the analyst reported. Either someone with extraordinary predictive abilities was manipulating these stocks, or the information in these documents is genuine. Meanwhile, investigative journalists began tracking down the individuals mentioned in the documents. Several former employees of both the Trump Organization and Musk's companies agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, confirming that meetings matching those described in the documents had indeed taken place. As the investigation deepened, cracks began to appear in the official denials. A former SpaceX engineer came forward with evidence that the company had indeed been developing the advanced surveillance satellites described in the documents. The engineer, who had been fired 6 months earlier for asking too many questions, provided technical schematics that matched those in Traore's documents almost perfectly. I was told these satellites were for enhanced communications, but the specifications didn't make sense for civilian internet service, the engineer explained in a protected interview. When I started asking questions about the military-grade imaging systems and electronic warfare capabilities, I was suddenly transferred to a different project. A week later, I was terminated for budget reasons. The revelation sent shockwaves through the tech industry. Other SpaceX employees began coming forward, describing a culture of secrecy around certain projects and unusual security measures that seemed excessive for civilian applications. On the political front, the pressure was mounting on both Trump and Musk to provide more detailed explanations. A group of bipartisan senators announced their intention to launch a formal congressional investigation, with subpoena power to compel testimony and document production. Senator Elizabeth Warren, long a critic of both Trump and Musk, was particularly vocal. The American people deserve to know if their president and one of the world's richest men conspired to exploit African resources through deception and technological manipulation. This investigation will have our full support and attention. But perhaps the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source, a former Trump administration official who had maintained detailed records of meetings and conversations during his time in office. The official, speaking through attorneys, confirmed that discussions matching those described in the documents had indeed taken place. The president was obsessed with what he called resource security, the official revealed. He frequently spoke about the need to secure critical mineral supplies before China could dominate the market. The meetings with Musk were presented as discussions about space policy, but they often focused on African mining opportunities. As evidence mounted supporting the authenticity of Traore's revelations, the African response grew more coordinated and forceful. The African Union announced the formation of a special investigative committee with the power to review all existing mining and infrastructure agreements with American companies. Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu announced the immediate suspension of all negotiations with American mining companies pending the completion of the investigation. We will not allow Nigeria to be turned into a modern-day colony, no matter how sophisticated the scheme, he declared. Similar announcements came from Kenya, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Within a week, virtually every major African nation had either suspended or announced reviews of their American business relationships. The economic impact was immediate and severe. American mining companies saw their stock prices plummet as their African operations faced uncertainty. Several major infrastructure projects were put on hold, costing American companies millions of dollars in lost contracts. But the African response went beyond mere economic retaliation. A Pan-African coalition of civil society organizations launched what they called the Digital Sovereignty Initiative, a campaign to develop Africa's own satellite and communications infrastructure independent of American or Chinese systems. For too long, we have been dependent on others for our basic communication needs, explained Dr. Amina Kone, a technology policy expert from Senegal who was leading the initiative. Whether the allegations are true or false, they highlight the vulnerability of African nations to technological manipulation. We must develop our own capabilities. The initiative quickly gained support from African governments and international donors. The European Union pledged €500 million in funding, while Japan and South Korea announced technical assistance programs. The corporate world's response to the unfolding scandal was swift and brutal. Major investors began demanding answers from both the Trump Organization and Musk's various companies. Tesla's stock price dropped 15% in the first week following the revelations, while SpaceX faced questions about its government contracts and international partnerships. Several major institutional investors announced they were reviewing their positions in companies associated with the alleged conspiracy. The California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS, one of the largest pension funds in the world, announced it was reassessing its significant Tesla holdings pending the outcome of the investigations. Our fiduciary duty requires us to consider not just financial returns, but also the reputational and legal risks associated with our investments, CalPERS announced in a statement. The allegations, if true, would represent precisely the kind of corporate behavior that creates long-term risk for investors. The pressure extended beyond just the main players. Companies that had been mentioned in the documents as potential partners or suppliers found themselves under scrutiny. Several major defense contractors were forced to issue statements denying knowledge of the alleged conspiracy, while tech companies scrambled to distance themselves from any association with the project. Amazon, whose satellite internet project Kuiper was mentioned in the documents as a potential competitor that needed to be neutralized, found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why it had not reported what appeared to be anti-competitive behavior to regulators. We were never approached about any conspiracy to limit competition in the satellite internet market, Amazon stated. Had we been aware of any such activity, we would have immediately reported it to the appropriate authorities. As the evidence continued to mount, legal challenges began emerging on multiple fronts. A coalition of African nations announced their intention to file a case with the International Court of Justice, alleging violations of international law and sovereignty. The legal theory was complex but compelling. If the allegations were true, the conspiracy would constitute a form of economic warfare designed to undermine African sovereignty and development. The case would seek not just damages, but also international sanctions against the individuals and companies involved. This is not simply a commercial dispute, explained Dr. Fatou Bensouda, the former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court who was advising the African Coalition. If these allegations are proven, they would represent a systematic attempt to undermine the sovereignty and development of an entire continent. This is exactly the kind of case that international law was designed to address. Domestically, the legal challenges were equally serious. The Department of Justice announced that it was opening a criminal investigation into potential violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits American companies from bribing foreign officials. Several class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of shareholders who claimed they had been defrauded by companies that failed to disclose their involvement in the alleged conspiracy. The lawsuits sought billions of dollars in damages and demanded complete transparency about the company's African operations. Perhaps most significantly, several states announced their own investigations. New York's Attorney General, citing the state's jurisdiction over many of the companies involved, announced a comprehensive investigation into potential securities fraud and consumer protection violations. As the story continued to dominate headlines worldwide, a parallel battle was being fought in the media landscape. Supporters of Trump and Musk launched a coordinated campaign to discredit both the documents and President Traore himself. Conservative media outlets began highlighting Traore's military background and his rise to power through a coup, suggesting that his motivations were suspect. They pointed to Burkina Faso's relationship with Russia as evidence that the revelations were part of a Russian disinformation campaign. "Why should we believe a military dictator who took power through violence?" asked a prominent conservative commentator. "This entire story reads like a Russian intelligence operation designed to undermine American business interests in Africa." The counterattack was sophisticated, involving social media campaigns, op-ed pieces, and coordinated appearances by surrogates on news programs. The effort was clearly well-funded and professionally managed, suggesting the involvement of major public relations firms. However, the campaign faced significant challenges. The technical specificity of the documents made them difficult to dismiss as simple fabrications, and the corroborating evidence that continued to emerge made the Russian disinformation narrative increasingly implausible. International media outlets, particularly those based in Africa and Europe, were largely skeptical of the American counter-narrative. African journalists, in particular, noted that the pattern of behavior described in the documents was consistent with historical patterns of Western exploitation of African resources. The details may be new, but the story is as old as colonialism itself, wrote a prominent Nigerian journalist. What's different this time is that an African leader had the courage to expose it before it was too late. The revelations created a full-scale diplomatic crisis that extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. Traditional alliances were strained as nations were forced to choose sides in what was becoming a global controversy. NATO allies found themselves in a particularly difficult position. While they generally supported American foreign policy, the allegations of economic colonialism were difficult to defend publicly. Several European leaders called for American transparency while avoiding direct criticism. "We believe in the importance of transparent and equitable international business relationships," stated German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in a carefully worded response. "All nations must respect the sovereignty and development aspirations of African partners." The crisis was particularly acute for France, which had its own complex history with African nations. President Macron found himself in the unusual position of having to defend African sovereignty against American interests, a reversal of the traditional dynamic. "France has learned from its past mistakes in Africa," Macron declared. "We cannot allow new forms of exploitation to replace the old ones, regardless of who is responsible." The diplomatic fallout extended to international organizations as well. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund found themselves under pressure to review their own relationships with the companies mentioned in the documents. Several ongoing projects were put on hold pending the outcome of the investigations. As technical experts continued to analyze the documents, the implications for global technology governance became increasingly clear. The alleged conspiracy represented a new form of technological colonialism that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the digital age. The satellite surveillance network described in the documents would give its operators unprecedented insight into the activities of entire nations. The ability to monitor communications, track movements, and even influence electronic systems could be used for economic, political, or military advantage. We're talking about a level of surveillance and control that would make George Orwell's 1984 look like a children's book, warned Dr. Shoshana Zuboff, a Harvard Business School professor who had written extensively about surveillance capitalism. The combination of satellite monitoring, AI analysis, and economic leverage would create a system of control that would be virtually impossible to escape. The mining technology described in the documents was equally concerning. The use of AI-driven extraction systems would allow for resource extraction at a scale and efficiency that could rapidly deplete entire regions while creating minimal local employment. Environmental scientists noted that the extraction methods described would be particularly devastating to fragile ecosystems. The documents suggested that environmental impact assessments would be conducted by companies controlled by the conspiracy, virtually guaranteeing approval regardless of actual environmental consequences. "This isn't just about economic exploitation," explained Dr. Wangari Maathai Jr., an environmental scientist from Kenya. "The scale of extraction described would cause irreversible environmental damage across much of Africa. We're talking about the potential destruction of entire ecosystems for short-term profit." The turning point in the crisis came exactly 2 weeks after Traore's initial broadcast, when a former high-level official in the Trump administration agreed to testify publicly before Congress. The official, who had served as a senior advisor on economic policy, had maintained detailed records of meetings and conversations related to African policy. The testimony was devastating. The official confirmed that the meetings described in the documents had indeed taken place, and that the broad outlines of the conspiracy were accurate. More importantly, the official revealed that the project had been discussed in the presence of other senior administration officials, making it impossible to dismiss as a rogue operation. The president was very clear about his objectives, the official testified. He wanted to secure American access to critical minerals before China could dominate the market. The partnership with Musk was seen as a way to use private sector innovation to achieve strategic national objectives. The official's testimony was particularly damaging because it revealed the involvement of other government agencies, including the CIA and the Department of Defense. The conspiracy was not just a private business arrangement, but a coordinated effort involving multiple branches of the American government. The revelation sent shockwaves through Washington. Several senior officials who had been named in the testimony immediately hired criminal defense attorneys. The White House was forced to acknowledge that discussions about African mineral resources had indeed taken place, though they continued to deny any improper or illegal activity. The confirmation of the conspiracy's basic elements triggered a cascade of consequences that reshaped international relations. The African Union voted unanimously to suspend all security cooperation with the United States, pending a full investigation and formal apology. The economic impact was immediate and severe. American companies lost billions of dollars in contracts across Africa, while Chinese and European companies moved quickly to fill the void. The shift represented a fundamental realignment of economic relationships that would have long-lasting consequences. Several African nations announced their intention to nationalize existing American mining operations, citing the conspiracy as evidence of bad faith dealing. While the legality of such actions was questionable, the political momentum was clearly against American interests. The crisis also accelerated existing trends toward African economic integration. The African Continental Free Trade Area, which had been struggling to gain momentum, suddenly found new energy as nations sought to reduce their dependence on external powers. This crisis has been a wake-up call for all of us, declared President Tinubu of Nigeria. We must work together to ensure that Africa's resources benefit Africa's people. The age of external exploitation must end. The technological implications were equally significant. The African Digital Sovereignty Initiative gained momentum as nations committed to developing their own satellite and communications infrastructure. The European Union and Japan announced major technology transfer programs to support African technological independence. As investigations continued and evidence mounted, both Trump and Musk found themselves facing serious legal and financial consequences. Criminal charges were filed in multiple jurisdictions, while civil lawsuits sought billions of dollars in damages. Trump's legal troubles were compounded by the fact that he was serving as president when the alleged conspiracy was developed. The revelation that he had used his office to advance a private business arrangement raised serious questions about abuse of power and potential impeachment. Congressional Republicans found themselves in an impossible position. While they wanted to support their president, the evidence of wrongdoing was overwhelming. Several prominent Republicans called for Trump to provide a full accounting of his actions. The American people deserve to know the truth, declared Senator Mitt Romney. If these allegations are true, they represent a fundamental betrayal of the public trust and the principles that America represents. Musk's situation was equally precarious. Tesla's stock price had fallen by more than 40% since the revelations began, wiping out hundreds of billions of dollars in market value. Several major investors called for his resignation from all his companies. SpaceX faced the prospect of losing its government contracts, which represented a significant portion of its revenue. The company's plans for Mars colonization suddenly seemed secondary to the earthly scandal that was consuming its founder. Perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the crisis was the acceleration of what many observers called an African Renaissance. The shock of the attempted conspiracy galvanized African nations in a way that decades of Pan-African rhetoric had failed to achieve. The African Union announced ambitious plans for continental integration, including a common currency, integrated infrastructure, and coordinated technology development. The plans were backed by substantial commitments from member nations, suggesting a level of political will that had been absent from previous integration efforts. This crisis has shown us that we must stand together or fall separately, declared President Ramaphosa of South Africa. The attempted conspiracy failed not because of outside intervention, but because of the courage of one African leader who refused to be silenced. We must ensure that such courage is never again necessary. The technological initiatives were particularly ambitious. The African Space Agency, which had been largely symbolic, suddenly found itself with substantial funding and clear mandates. Plans were announced for African-controlled satellite networks, indigenous technology development, and comprehensive educational programs. International partners, particularly European and Asian nations, were eager to support African technological independence as a way of reducing American and Chinese influence on the continent. The result was an influx of technology and investment that accelerated African development in unprecedented ways. The conspiracy's exposure and the subsequent global response marked a fundamental shift in international relations. The unipolar moment of American dominance was definitively over, replaced by a more complex multipolar world where African nations had newfound agency and influence. China, while pleased to see American influence diminished, found itself facing new challenges as African nations became more assertive about their own interests. The era of simply replacing Western exploitation with Chinese exploitation was clearly over. European nations, meanwhile, found themselves in a unique position to benefit from the new dynamics. Their historical experience with decolonization, combined with their technological capabilities and financial resources, made them attractive partners for African nations seeking alternatives to both American and Chinese influence. The technology sector underwent its own transformation. The dominance of American tech companies was challenged by new players from Africa, Europe, and Asia. The African Digital Sovereignty Initiative spawned dozens of indigenous technology companies that competed directly with established players. The age of technological colonialism is ending, declared Dr. Cohn, who had emerged as a leading voice in the African tech movement. We are entering an era where every nation and every people can participate as equals in the digital future. Years later, historians would mark President Traore's broadcast as a pivotal moment in 21st century history. The exposure of the conspiracy not only prevented a new form of colonialism, but also accelerated the emergence of a more equitable global order. The legal consequences were severe and long-lasting. Trump faced multiple criminal charges and was ultimately convicted on several counts of corruption and abuse of power. His conviction effectively ended his political career and served as a warning to future leaders about the consequences of putting personal interests above national duties. Musk's empire largely collapsed under the weight of legal challenges and lost government contracts. While he remained wealthy, his influence and reputation were permanently damaged. The companies he had built were forced to restructure and adopt new leadership, ultimately becoming more responsible corporate citizens. The conspiracy's failure also led to significant reforms in international business law. New regulations were established to prevent the kind of coordinated exploitation that had been attempted, while international monitoring mechanisms were created to detect and prevent similar conspiracies in the future. But perhaps the most important legacy was the demonstration that even the most powerful individuals and nations could be held accountable for their actions. The courage of one African leader in speaking truth to power had changed the course of history and created a more just world for all. The story of President Traore's revelations became a teaching tool in schools around the world, a reminder that democracy and justice require constant vigilance, and that sometimes the most important voices come from the most unexpected places. In Burkina Faso, Traore's decision to expose the conspiracy was celebrated as a defining moment of national pride. The country, once known primarily for its poverty and political instability, had suddenly become a symbol of integrity and courage on the world stage. "We may be a small nation," Traore reflected in a later interview, "but we proved that size doesn't matter when you're fighting for what's right. The world is watching, and history will judge us all by our actions in moments of crisis." The broadcast that had begun with fewer than 50,000 viewers ultimately reached billions of people and changed the course of human history. It was a reminder that in an interconnected world, the actions of one person in one small country can reshape the entire global order. The world that emerged from the crisis was not perfect, but it was more equitable and more hopeful than the one that had existed before. And it all began with one man's decision to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences.